Hello guys, welcome back in this new video. Today you will learn how to create an API gateway to connect to your SageMaker endpoint. And we have previously built an end-to-end machine learning model. If you haven't seen that video, I'm gonna leave it here. You can see that in my channel here, AWS SageMaker end-to-end machine learning model part 1. That was the first part of building an end-to-end machine learning model. And in today's video, we're going to focus on that second part, which is going to allow the user to query that endpoint that we have currently hosted on AWS SageMaker. This is the endpoint that we are going to query. And since the user cannot directly query that endpoint from an API gateway, then we are first going to create a Lambda function which is going to be plugged to that endpoint. And once the user submits a query, then we are going to use an API gateway to retrieve all the details from AWS Lambda function. For those who don't know me, my name is Umana Keita. I create content about all things AI, machine learning, and technology in general. And here are a couple of videos that I have created on my channel. If this is something you are interested in, subscribe to my channel and also activate the notification bell so that you don't miss anything in my future videos. The first thing here is to create a Lambda function. So get back to your console. If you don't see Lambda here, you can type Lambda function. And once we have that Lambda opened, then create a new Lambda function, and we are calling that Lambda function classification Lambda function, or text classification. Let's call it text classification for making things easier. Text classification Lambda, and the runtime is Python. Preferably take the latest version of Python, so Python 3.12. And now let's get to change default execution role and leave this one. If it's not checked, check the create new role with basic Lambda permission. And from that, we'll be able to configure that role to give it access to SageMaker, to be able to interact with SageMaker. And leave everything else by default and create your Lambda function. Great. Once that Lambda function is created, you should see a pop-up here telling that the Lambda function has been successfully created. And here's the name of the Lambda function that has been created. And now what we need to implement is the function that is going to be interacting with our SageMaker endpoint. This is the default function that is created upon the creation of the Lambda function. And here I'm going to paste the Lambda function that is going to be able to interact with our SageMaker endpoint. First, we have the global environment here, endpoint name, operating system, environment variable, endpoint name. And now we specify the runtime, which is Bodo 3 client, runtime SageMaker. Let's try to understand what this function does. First of all, we have the JSON. This is going to get the events corresponding to the input sent by the user, and we get the text fields of that input. It's going to be a JSON format. Then we get the text portion of that, which is the user's request. And now we encode that text into UTF-8. And here is where we query the Lambda endpoint. We have runtime.invoke endpoint. We specify the endpoint that we have specified here. The content type, which is application text. Accept Lambda, accept application JSON verbose body is the encoded text that we have encoded here. And we can print the raw response of the Lambda function. Now comes the parsing of the response of the model. Within the model response, if you recall previously, we had that in the notebook that we have created. Within the notebook at the end, let's go to the end of the notebook. We had that function called parse response, which is going to parse all the details from the model's prediction. So what I have done is to basically get that function and also have the corresponding implementation in Lambda. And this is what we are having here. And here we get the probability labels, predicted label. And here we determine which sentiment has been predicted by the model. Positive if the predicted label is 1, else it's negative. And here the results, we want to return a dictionary, which is going to be basically a JSON of sentiment. This is the sentiment of the model. Probability, this is going to be probabilities. And label, here we'll have also the labels. Now, finally, we return the result. And now what we do is we see that we have the endpoint here. That endpoint is nowhere specified in the codes. So what we need to do is to create that environment variable. And to create the environment variable, we select configure. And with it configure, you'll see environment variable portion here. And now edit. Once we edit, we add new environment. The key is endpoint name, and the value is here we get the SageMaker. This is the endpoint name. And after copying that endpoint, now we get back to the Lambda function and we paste that endpoint and finally save. And after saving this, we should be able getting back to code. That Lambda function should be able to have access to that specific endpoint name here. But there is one thing though, we cannot even test this Lambda function because it does not have access to query SageMaker endpoint. And to be able to perform that endpoint query, we need to give access to the roles that has been created for SageMaker, for Lambda function to query a SageMaker endpoint. But before that, we can just deploy our Lambda function because there is no more change that is going to be performed here, and Lambda function successfully updated. So this is going to make the Lambda function deployed. We need to give Lambda an IAM role to query that SageMaker endpoint, and to be able to do that, we select IAM, and from IAM we select role. And within that role, to find which role has been created for our specific Lambda function. If you remember, when we were creating the Lambda function, we set up a default role. And that is going to create a role during the creation of the Lambda function, a role with the exact same name with the Lambda function that we have created. So we copy the name of our Lambda function, come back to IAM role, and we paste that. Here is the role that has been created during the creation of the Lambda function. Now we need to change that role, edit that role. Here from the name of a policy attached to that role, we select the policy. And now what we need to do is, let's have a look at the current configuration of the policy. Here is the current configuration of a policy for our Lambda execution role. And now what we need to do is to add another statement to allow Lambda function to query the endpoints, and then we edit. And here we have a couple of policies available in the statements as a list of policies. And now we add that new policy. So what that new policy is going to do is to be able, to give Lambda function the execution role to invoke here SageMaker endpoint. So what we are giving here is the effect is allow our Lambda function to invoke an endpoint, which is a SageMaker endpoint, and it's going to have access to all the resources from SageMaker. Once we have that, then we select next, and finally save all the changes. Now that we have given Lambda the right to invoke SageMaker endpoints, we can test the Lambda function, and let's give the Lambda function a name. Let's say test classification model. All right. And also, if you remember, we need to give a payload to that Lambda function, and that payload is a JSON format. We give a text. I really enjoyed this movie because this model has been trained on a data set about movies. So we give it an example. I really enjoyed this movie. The acting was superb, and the plot was engaging. And let's click test. This is going to test to configure the testing of the model. And now what we do is to test the Lambda function. Here we see that the test name is test classification model. Here is the response. The response is given here. Sentiment is positive, probabilities is This corresponds to the probabilities that we have specified here, because we also wanted to get the probabilities from the Lambda function. And we also have the labels for each label in the classification, in the result of the prediction. We have label 0, label 1, and the highest probability is the one with 0.55, which corresponds to the first one. And 1 means positive because we have that here. If positive, then prediction label is 1. Otherwise, it's negative, which is 0. Instead of having to query Lambda function all the time, because users will not directly have access to our Lambda function. Here, users will not have directly access to our Lambda function because they are outside the network. This is currently here. Yeah, this should be here. That user is outside of our environment and does not have access to directly query the Lambda function. Then what we do is to create that API gateway, which is the interaction between the Lambda function and the user's input. Then once the user submits the payload, that payload first goes to the API endpoint, and that endpoint is going to query the Lambda function. And finally, Lambda function interact with the endpoint, and Lambda function will also get back to the API endpoint with the result, and that result is going to be sent to our user. That's what we're going to implement, the last phase of our end-to-end workflow. Now to create an API gateway endpoint, this is done from the search bar, search for API gateway. And from API gateway, we can start by creating a new API. And this is going to be a REST API because we want to build that REST API. And select build, new API tab, and give that new API a name. I will say text classification API gateway. Description is, let's leave it optional. And for API endpoint type, let's make this regional, available regionally. Create an API. And after the API is created, you should see a pop-up saying successfully created REST API. And from the APIs, we should see also the name of the API that we have created. And now to be able to further configure that API, we select the name of the API, and now we create a resource. That resource is basically going to be the path to access that API. Let's call it text classification fine-tuned model. Okay, and we create the resource. And after creating that resource, then it's going to be the path, basically like the URL that is going to be provided so that we can access the API that has been created, and the API is finally going to access the Lambda function. And once the resource gets the user's input, it's going to post that input to Lambda function. And for that, we create a method. We create a new method, and the type of that method is post, because it's going to get the input of the payload from the user and post that to Lambda function. And here we select the choice of Lambda function. And once we have that Lambda function, our region is US is 1, and we choose the ARN of the Lambda function. Here it should like show the list of all the Lambda functions that we have created. But this might also be confusing, and to be able to make sure things are not getting any issue, you can just come back to a Lambda function that has been created and copy the ARN of that Lambda function, and we get back to our get API gateway, and we paste that ARN here, and here is what we get. And once we have that configured, we select create the method. After creating that method, we should see successfully created method post. This is a post method. And now we can test our API. Select the test option, and query string, leave it this empty. Headers, leave this empty as well. And the body is exactly the same that we can provide when we were testing our Lambda function here. And that was when we're testing, we can get back and take the same input invent. We copy the same input and put that to here as a test. And now we can test our API. And testing that API, we should get a response. And here is a positive response. I mean, a good response because the status is 200. This means that the API has been successfully tested, and we have the response body here. Sentiment is positive, probabilities, we have the probability scores here and the labels here. And here we have the response header and all the logs corresponding to the execution of that Lambda function. Perfect. We have successfully implemented an API gateway that interact with our Lambda function, and that Lambda function triggers the endpoint run the processes to respond to Lambda, and that Lambda gives the result to the API gateway, and users can finally receive the response from the API gateway. Now, let's say that your team has tested that API and is completely happy with everything. The next step is to make that API available to the public users. And to do that, you need to deploy your API. And this is done by selecting the deploy API section, and the stage, let's say new stage, and the stage name, let's say deployment environment. This is a deployment environment. Description, let's leave the description empty, and deploy your API. This is going to deploy your API and create and invoke URL for that API. And now we can test the API. Let's get back to this environment. And to be able to test that API, we have a specific instruction that I have set up here. This is the instruction that we are going to use to test that API. First, we create a post request, deployment, invoke URL, the resource path, the one that we have created during the creation of the resource. The data is JSON.dump your payload. This is the exact payload that we have been using with Lambda function and also with the API. So I'm just going to remove that, and let's say that Python, I'm going to create a Python, and to be able to use requests and JSON, we need to import those. So let's import JSON, import requests as report as RE. And now this is the statement, the instruction. I'm going to complete that instruction. And here, the deployment invoke URL is the one that we have here. Invoke URL, we copy that invoke URL and paste that invoke URL here. We have the invoke URL. Now the resource path is the resource path that we also created for the API. Let's come back in the API section. Here is the resource path, text classification model, function model. This is the resource path. And come back again, put the resource path. Oh no, my bad. Yeah, correct. Here is the resource path. And now we put the payloads. I'm gonna put the payload here. I have the payload. I'm gonna copy that payload and paste the payload. Remember, the payload is the exact same JSON that we were using. I'm gonna put this one here, all right? And paste the payload, enter. Now we have the request. If you just put the request, you'll see that you are only going to get the response like this object. And to be able to see the actual result, then we have to put request that content. This is going to put the content of the result. Here we can see the sentiment, positive, probabilities. We have the probability scores here. Here is how you can invoke that endpoint from any API that you are creating. You just have to provide this environment. At the end of the day, you are not going to ask users to give these values because those are the values that are already created by your team, and you are only going to request that text, and programmatically you are going to have the placeholder for that text. This is it, the end of that series of 2 videos about end-to-end deployment of the machine learning model, and also creating an API using API gateway Lambda function to also deploy that into production. And after this tutorial, please don't forget to clean up your endpoint. So this can be done by running the following command: fine-tune predictor, delete the model. So you're going to delete the model from your SageMaker, and also delete the endpoint so that it does not occur any charges. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and also share with your friends. As always, let me know in the comment section which video you want me to cover in my future videos. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye bye.